Tonight we drift into a world where the breeze stops breathing after sunset and shadows stretch just a little too long along the path ahead. You're wandering through a quiet Korean village, somewhere between the 15th and 17th centuries, where the air is cool and laced with the scent of pine and smoke. Lanterns flicker behind hanji paper windows, casting soft gold glows into the night, while crickets sing their endless lullaby. But there's one sound you never hear: no sharp notes, no idle tunes, nobody whistles, not the old men smoking pipes, not the boys running errands, not even the drunk merchant stumbling home, because here in this place after the sun sets, whistling is not just rude, it's dangerous. The elders say that if you whistle after dark, you might summon something you didn't mean to. Not a stray dog, not a curious bird. No, something else entirely. Something cold, weightless, and far older than your footsteps on the packed dirt. Something that has no business walking but might just answer your song. You think about whistling just for fun, but then again you probably won't survive this. Just kidding. Probably. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far or strange, let me know your location and your local time. I love seeing where this sleepy little time machine reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you keep walking through this sleeping village, you begin to notice just how deeply the silence has settled. It's not the absence of sound, it's a deliberate quiet. Like the entire village has collectively agreed to hush, not because someone is listening, but because something is. In ancient Korean culture, especially during the late Goryeo and early Joseon dynasties, the fear of whistling after dark wasn't just rural gossip. It was a widely held belief that persisted across regions, social classes, and even centuries. This unease stems largely from the cultural entanglement with gwishin Korean spirits, or ghosts that were believed to linger in the human realm due to unresolved emotions, tragic deaths, or improper funeral rites. Gwishin were not the friendly sort. They were often depicted with long black hair, white mourning clothes, and expressions of quiet sorrow or seething rage. The sound of whistling, sharp, human, and oddly luring, was thought to mimic the cries or songs of these spirits. Some even believed it was how the gwishin found you. They followed the sound like moths to candlelight, or perhaps like wolves tracing the scent of a wounded deer. Not all gwishin were malicious, but most weren't exactly cuddly. They were reminders of death, of failed rituals, of people left out of society's tightly woven net of ancestor veneration. You see, in Confucian-influenced Korea, the dead weren't just gone. They were still part of the household, still watching, still requiring care through offerings and rites. If someone died suddenly, violently, or far from home and never received proper rites, their spirit might linger. And in the stillness of night, a stray whistle could become a beacon for the forgotten. Some villagers said that whistling at night caused dogs to bark at nothing or fires to sputter and die. Others warned of sudden winds of dreams that weren't yours, of footsteps behind you when the path was clear. These weren't always fatal, but they were frightening enough to teach children early lips stay closed after sunset. It was a kind of social lullaby, like telling kids not to eat too much sugar before bed, but with higher stakes. Also, fewer dentists. What makes this more fascinating is that whistling during the day was mostly fine. Workers whistled in fields, children mimicked birds, and even merchants might use it to draw attention. But as soon as the sky turned purple and the hills grew dark, the rule shifted. The same sound that passed for amusement in the sun became taboo by moonlight. That transformation hints at something deeper than fear. It suggests ritual. Like the way candles mean warmth in the living room, but might spook you in a dark forest. Even the architecture seems to echo the silence. Traditional Korean homes, or hanok, were designed with an acute awareness of nature and spiritual balance. Courtyards let moonlight pour in gently. Eaves curved like arms embracing the household. The floors, often built with the ondol system for radiant heat, stayed warm under your feet, even as ghosts crept past the gates outside. That's right, the underfloor heating system had to pull double duty, keeping you warm and keeping you from noticing the goosebumps. Modern scholars often ask, was this fear purely spiritual, or was there something more practical at play? Some argue that this taboo might have started as a social control mechanism, an easy way to make sure people stayed quiet and inside after curfew. Others wonder if the sound of whistling actually interfered with natural predator alerts. Did it attract wild animals or even enemy attention? During wartime, there's even a theory, albeit not widely accepted, that low-frequency whistling could aggravate certain nocturnal birds or bats. Honestly, bats are creepy enough without sound experiments. But the simplest explanation remains the most powerful people feared the unseen. They feared the cold spots in the room, the dreams that whispered secrets, the nights when the sky felt heavier than usual. And in a culture that treated ancestors with reverence and ghosts with respect, breaking the silence of night with a sharp note was like poking a sleeping tiger. Or worse, waking something that should never have slept. So as you continue this moonlit walk through the still village, you start to understand why the air feels sacred, why no one sings, why the trees seem to lean in a little listening. The silence isn't empty, it's full of stories of memories of ancient rules, and it tells you gently, hush. The night grows deeper as your steps carry you past rows of hanok rooftops that gleam under the soft gaze of the moon. There's a stillness now that doesn't simply suggest quiet, it insists on it. Even the crickets seem to fade into the background like they too know better than to raise their voices. And just when you're beginning to think this village might have invented silence, an old tale stirs in your memory, something a grandmother once whispered, with a face as serious as stone. "Don't whistle at night," she warned, "unless you want to see who's listening." She meant the gwishin, sure, but she also meant something else. Something cold-blooded with scales that caught moonlight like silver. She meant snakes. In ancient Korea there was a widespread folk belief that whistling after dark could summon snakes, not metaphorical ones, not symbolic, real slithering snakes. Why, no one seems entirely sure. Some say it was the pitch of the whistle, sharp and high, mimicking the sound of certain prey animals. Others suggest that it was the vibration traveling low through the ground like a calling card. There's a fringe theory that gets thrown around sometimes that snakes, being sensitive to ground vibrations, might actually investigate sudden, high-pitched noises, especially if they're unusual in a nighttime setting. It's unlikely to be the main reason for the belief, but it's just plausible enough to make you pause. Of course, historians still argue whether this belief was grounded in any ecological truth, or whether it was simply one of those elegant superstitions that made life more narratively satisfying. You know, the kind like, don't go near the well at night, or never sleep with your feet pointed toward the door. These ideas often carry more emotional weight than logical basis. They keep you alert, teach you caution, and sometimes they just make a good story stick. But Korea has snakes, quite a few actually, and in pre-modern times encountering one in your home could be more than a nuisance. It could be a death sentence, especially with no quick access to medicine. The mamushi and kuneogeom native venomous snakes weren't exactly eager to cuddle. So imagine you're a mother in a mountain village and your child starts whistling by the fire after dark. You're going to say, whatever it takes to stop that, right? You'll call, the snakes might have been the perfect blend of truth and terror. Snakes also held symbolic meaning in Korea's spiritual imagination. Unlike in Western cultures, where serpents often symbolize outright evil, Hello Garden of Eden East Asian views were more nuanced. In Korean folklore, snakes could be wise, malevolent, or simply mysterious. In some cases, they were guardians of sacred sites, especially mountain shrines. In others, they were the chosen form of wandering spirits, or mountain deities, known as sansin. These deities were protectors of the forest and animals, often appearing in dreams or rituals. But, like any divine force, they demanded respect and sometimes silence. Interestingly, some scholars have pointed out that the connection between whistling and snakes might have a shamanic thread. Korean mudang female shamans used music, chants, and sound in their rituals to communicate with the spirit world. But whistling was generally absent. Some say it was avoided deliberately as it might call forth the wrong spirit or animal, or worse, an animal with a spirit inside it. There are tales where snakes were believed to be the vessel of a human soul that had been cursed, or worse, refused rebirth. In these narratives, the whistle becomes more than a sound, it becomes a key. So let's paint this picture. You're in the countryside in the 1500s. The millet harvest has ended, and the rice paddies are waterlogged with autumn rain. The fire crackles in the ondol-heated floor beneath you. Your younger cousin starts whistling a little tune she heard from a traveling peddler. You glance toward the door. It's closed, but the wood creaks slightly in the wind. You hear a rustle from the wall, a soft, deliberate sound like something dry brushing against straw mats. Your heart starts to thump, not because you believe in ghosts exactly, but because your grandmother's warning has taken root in your spine. And then you hear another whistle echoing back, but you're sure no one else is outside. You tell her to stop. Not sharply, not panicked, just quiet, firm. Because whether it's a snake, a spirit, or something unnamed that lingers near the eaves of your thatched roof, you've remembered the rule. And some rules aren't meant to be tested even centuries later. One of the curious things about this belief is that it overlaps with Korea's changing relationship to nature. In older animist traditions before Buddhism and Confucianism took deep root, the natural world wasn't just scenery, it was populated by spirits. Trees had memories, rocks had moods, animals could be messengers or omens. In this context, whistling after dark was not simply impolite, it was a breach of contract with the unseen world. You didn't just disturb the peace, you invited attention, and not the good kind. Modern scientists, of course, have tested the acoustic sensitivity of snakes and concluded that while they don't hear in the human sense, they do detect vibrations. Still, none of this explains why the belief persisted so long or why it was shared between villages that had never spoken to each other. It was as if the story itself slithered across regions, hiding in shadowed corners and slipping into new dialects. The snake didn't need to be real. The fear was. Today you'll still hear the warning sometimes, though now it's offered with a chuckle, a kind of cultural inheritance wrapped in amusement. Don't whistle at night, someone might say, unless you want to meet the ghost snake. And whether you believe in literal reptiles, restless spirits, or just a deeply satisfying superstition, you might find yourself hesitating the next time your lips purse under a moonlit sky. And so you continue walking under branches heavy with dew, past fences of split bamboo and thatched walls. The air feels thicker now. You imagine a sound, a distant hiss, or maybe just wind. Either way, you don't whistle. You continue your slow walk beneath the ink-dark sky, the gravel crunching gently beneath your feet as you pass by a small shrine nestled against the hillside. Its wooden frame leans slightly from age, its roof covered in moss and pine needles. You pause, sensing that this place, like the rest of the village, demands a certain reverence, and then you remember the wind. It had stopped some time ago, or maybe it never really blew. That's when another old belief resurfaces, one tied not just to ghosts or snakes, but to the wind itself. In ancient Korea, they used to say the wind could hear you. Long before standardized religions took hold, much of Korea was steeped in animistic traditions where natural phenomena were alive and sentient. Trees, rocks, rivers, and wind were not inert, they were aware. And whistling after dark was not a harmless tune, it was a disturbance. You weren't just making noise, you were calling out to the spirits that rode the breeze, slept in mountain caves, or curled around ancient stones. Spirits who, depending on their mood, might follow your voice home. In particular, there were deep beliefs surrounding mountain spirits known as sansin. These guardian deities were thought to dwell in Korea's countless forested peaks and ridges, and though often benevolent, they were easily offended by disrespect. Whistling at night, especially near a mountain, was seen as a way of provoking these forces. Why would you want to do that? Good question. You probably wouldn't. But sound travels differently at night, doesn't it? It's crisper, carries farther. and that sharp, high whistle could echo and bounce off the stones in such a way that it didn't just wake something, it might guide it straight to you. It was said that if you whistled in a valley after dark, you might hear it come back to you, but changed. A different pitch, a new rhythm, an echo that didn't quite match your original note. Maybe a trick of acoustics, or maybe not. Historians still debate whether these tales came from early experiments in sound and echo across Korea's mountainous terrain, or if they were always just metaphorical. Either way, they became part of the shared language of caution. The wind they whispered could carry your voice straight to the spirit world. Interestingly, there are recorded rituals where sound was carefully used to summon divine attention. Shamanic practices included drumming bells and chanting, but never whistling, not even once. The absence is conspicuous. Scholars have pointed out that whistle tones are too piercing, too unpredictable. They slice through the air like knives, unlike the rounded rhythmic resonance of drums or gongs. Maybe the whistling was considered too sharp for sacred spaces, or maybe it opened doors rather than knocking politely. And then there's the matter of dokkaebi, Korea's goblin-like creatures, often mischievous but sometimes dangerous. Folktales describe them as pranksters who loved music and noise but could also be summoned unintentionally by whistling. Imagine that you're just trying to entertain yourself on a cold night, and the next thing you know, you've got a supernatural trickster rearranging your furniture and eating your rice. Whistling wasn't just forbidden, it was considered irresponsible. The animist traditions didn't vanish entirely with the spread of Buddhism and Confucianism. Instead, they wove themselves into the fabric of religious life. Even after monasteries were built and Confucian rites formalized, people still paid respects to the mountain, still avoided certain stones, and still warned children not to whistle after sunset. Because the mountains, they said, never forget. Let's take a moment here. You're standing just outside that shrine, the grass beneath your feet damp from evening mist. The leaves in the nearby grove rustle, not quite wind, not quite animal, just movement. You remember that whistling could wake the wind, but not the good kind, not a gentle spring breeze, more like an old breath from something forgotten. And if it hears you, well, let's not find out. There's a famous Korean story about a boy who tried to mimic the wind with his whistle just to impress his friends. He was from a village near Gangwon province, where the mountains are sharp and stern. They dared him to go out to the old pine grove and whistle 3 times. He did. The first echo came back right away, perfectly. The second came slower. The third wasn't his echo at all. It was too low, too long, and it didn't stop. He ran home, they say, with blood at the corners of his mouth and no voice left. Ever. Was it true? Who knows, but it worked. No one whistled in that village again. What's fascinating is how these stories evolved over time. In some versions, the whistle awakens a wind spirit. In others, it simply alerts wandering ghosts. In the most extreme tales, the whistle doesn't summon something external. It splits the air in such a way that it lets something through, a rift, a rent, a tear in the veil. That's right. We're now in sleep paralysis demon territory. Still think it's worth whistling. And of course, there are skeptics who argue that the fear of whistling was simply a form of nighttime discipline. Keep people quiet, keep kids indoors, reduce the chance of drawing attention during times of war or strife. After all, Korean history has its fair share of invasions, banditry, and sudden disappearances. If a whistle could be mistaken for a signal or an alert, then forbidding it after dark was just good security. But again, if that were true, why the snakes? Why the spirits? Why the wind? You continue down the dirt path, the shrine now behind you. The forest presses close to the road here, its edges fraying into shadows. You think about whistling just to see what the trees might do. But then again, some traditions are better kept even by visitors. Even by the curious, especially by the curious. And besides, there are plenty of other sounds to fill the night owls in the canopy, the occasional hoot of a deer, the soft creak of bamboo leaning in the wind. Natural sounds. Predictable sounds. You don't need to add your own. You're not here to wake anything. You're here to listen. You've wandered now beyond the last lit house, the paper lanterns fading into pinpricks behind you. The moon overhead is wide and watchful, casting the path ahead in a soft bluish glow. It's here in this hush, between civilization and wilderness, that you start to feel it, the ancient awareness in the land itself. Not just stories, not just fears, but a presence embedded in the very soil. You're walking through memory. And in old Korea, memory was rarely mute. It whispered through the trees, sighed across rooftops, and lingered in the most subtle of sounds. And so tonight, it's time to talk about the echoes, about sound mountains, and why silence was never truly silent. Before the rise of centralized kingdoms, the Korean peninsula was a landscape of animism, shamanic rituals, and reverence for nature's moods. Mountains especially were sacred. They weren't just scenery, they were living beings, repositories of spiritual power, and often viewed as ancestral guardians. This wasn't metaphor, it was belief. People bowed to mountains, they left offerings, they avoided shouting near them, especially at night. And whistling, absolutely not. That was like knocking on the mountain's forehead with a stick and saying, "Hey, wake up and come play." One curious and often overlooked detail in Korean folklore is the idea that mountains have voices of their own, not just metaphorical personalities, but actual sounds, whispering wind, rustling trees, even strange drumming noises that echoed through valleys. These were interpreted not as natural oddities, but as the mountains speaking. And whistling, especially by someone impure, disrespectful, or simply foolish, was seen as provoking these voices. Some said you'd hear laughter in return. Others swore you'd hear your own whistle played back at you, warped. This might sound outlandish, but the landscape plays along. Korea's mountainous terrain is particularly prone to natural acoustic effects. Narrow valleys, jagged cliffs, and bowl-shaped hollows amplify and distort sound. Historians still argue whether the fear of night whistling in these regions began with spiritual concerns or acoustic confusion. Did someone whistle once, hear an echo that didn't match, and assume it came from a ghost? Or were they always taught that voices in the hills meant you'd disturbed the invisible? Let's not forget the role of shamanism here. Korea's indigenous spiritual system practiced by mudang emphasized ritual, sound, and trance. The gut, a shamanic rite, was often performed to heal illness, appease angry spirits, or send the dead to their rightful place. Instruments like gongs, drums, and bells were used to shape the space, draw attention from gods, and push malevolent beings away. But whistling, it was conspicuously absent, almost taboo. It's as if whistling had no place in the sacred order of sounds. Too unpredictable, too wild, too capable of summoning something that didn't belong. There's a story from a fishing village on Korea's southern coast. An old woman, widowed young and known for her strange habits, used to walk the cliff paths every night, whistling a haunting tune. She said it was the wind's lullaby, but one year, fish stopped appearing. Boats sank without cause, the sea turned glassy and dead. Finally, the village shaman confronted her. "You're not calling the wind," he said. "You're calling something through it." She stopped. The fish returned. The story lives on. Again, who knows the truth, but truth wasn't always the point. The point was not to risk it. The link between sound and sacredness also shows up in Korea's Buddhist traditions. Monasteries were often nestled in remote mountains, chosen precisely for their isolation. Here, silence wasn't just peaceful, it was essential. Monks adhered to strict codes of conduct, including rules about speech and noise. Evening hours were meant for meditation and inner reflection, not idle sounds. Some temples even had designated quiet zones where no conversation was allowed. Whistling in these spaces utterly unthinkable. It wasn't just disruptive, it was profane. Interestingly, there's one exception, the moktak, a wooden percussion instrument used in chants and prayers. It's sharp, rhythmic, and meant to pierce the fog of thought during rituals. But even this sound was carefully controlled, never frivolous. Whistling, with its playful and spontaneous character, didn't belong. It wandered too far from formality, from discipline. And in Buddhist practice, unregulated noise could be a sign of an undisciplined mind. Which brings us to another question. scholars love to chew on was the fear of whistling simply a way to enforce moral order. Think about it, most taboos target behaviors that are spontaneous, undirected, and difficult to police. Laughing at funerals, singing during prayer, whistling at night, these aren't crimes but they're disruptions. And ancient societies, especially ones built on Confucian values, were deeply concerned with harmony between generations, between realms, and even between hours of the day. Night belonged to stillness. Whistling violated that. And here's your fringe fact for the night. Some old Korean folktales claim that when a person whistles near a certain type of stone, usually jet black, smooth and rounded, the stone might answer back, not with noise, with heat. That's right, some say the stone would warm under your touch as if awakened. Were they referring to basalt, to volcanic rock? Maybe. Or maybe they were just telling kids to stop messing around with sacred cairns. So here you are, continuing your quiet trek under the stars. You pass a black stone beside the road. It's just sitting there, harmless. But you feel its presence all the same. And even though your lips part, slightly tempted to send a note into the darkness, you close them again. The air is rich enough with memory. You don't need to add anything. And maybe that's the point of all these beliefs, not to silence you exactly, but to remind you that sound has meaning, that what you release into the night might not vanish. It might echo, it might ripple, it might return. So you move forward, steps slow and deliberate, not fearing the dark, but respecting it. The wind returns soft and low. It brushes past your ears like a secret. But you don't answer. Not tonight. You leave the shadow of the mountain shrine behind and begin to descend a narrow trail toward the heart of the old village. The roofs reappear, layered like fallen leaves, and the faint smell of wood smoke returns to the air. But here, even among homes and fences, the silence remains profound. It's not just the quiet of people asleep, it's a hush maintained with purpose. And as you glance toward the wider roads that once led to the palace walls, you remember that this avoidance of whistling wasn't limited to small, rural settlements. Even in the royal courts of the Joseon dynasty, there were unspoken rules, and sometimes very spoken rules, about what could and couldn't be heard after nightfall. That's right. Whistling wasn't merely a superstition of peasants and fishermen. It reached into the strict hierarchical world of Confucian court etiquette. And that world, it was obsessed with order. The kind of order that made rules about how many times you could bow, how loud your footsteps should be on a polished floor, and whether your shadow was standing in the correct place during a ritual. So imagine trying to explain a random shrill noise piercing through all that precision. Yeah. No one was amused. In the annals of court conduct, especially during the reign of King Sejong in the 15th century, there are documents detailing how noise should be regulated after dusk. Gates were closed, early instruments silenced, and even messenger movements were restricted. The night belonged to scholars, ritualists, and rest-not musicians or idle murmurs. Whistling, with its carefree energy and lack of purpose, would have been considered deeply disrespectful. It implied a lack of discipline, a kind of emotional looseness that didn't align with the Confucian ideal of the restrained, harmonious gentleman. There's a particularly obscure record from the Gyeongguk Daejeon, the Great Code of Law, compiled during early Joseon, that references the need to maintain auditory purity during ritual periods. Historians still argue whether this referred directly to whistling, but many believe the language was broad enough to cover it. And beyond laws, there were customs more powerful than any legal code. Custom dictated that palace staff avoid any unnecessary noise at night. Guards were trained to communicate with soft footsteps and specific taps of their weapons. Couriers used coded knocks. Even the palace gisang highly trained female entertainers never practiced musical pieces after dark unless summoned. Now here's the fringe part. Some legends say that even the palace ghosts responded to whistling. That there was a section of the royal palace, an older wing long unused, where servants claimed to hear phantom echoes late at night. Supposedly one servant once whistled near it on a dare. The next morning his hair had gone white. Spooked maybe, haunted possibly, fired almost definitely. This mix of law, custom and law helped create an environment where sound was power. In court, music known as ayak, each note, each pause was measured and purposeful. The idea was that music mirrored the moral order of the universe. So what was whistling an interruption, a personal whim? In other words, chaos. If aak was the sound of Confucian virtue, then a whistle was basically musical anarchy. And the court wasn't just worried about the living. Ancestors too had ears. Many royal rituals involved speaking to the spirits of past kings, queens, and officials. These rituals were conducted at altars or within special halls like the Jongmyo Shrine in Seoul. The environment had to be pure, not just visually, but sonically. It was believed that stray sounds could distract or offend the ancestral spirits. A whistle could be interpreted not only as disrespect, but as a call. And when you're surrounded by centuries of dead royalty, you want to be very, very careful about who's listening. It wasn't all fear and formality, though. There were also whispers about strange sounds heard late at night in royal compounds, sounds no one could explain. Some attributed them to the creaking of old timbers, others to fox spirits or kumiho in disguise. But a few believed it was the palace itself responding to disobedient sounds, that walls could groan in protest, that tiles could shift, that something ancient older than kings and queens lived beneath the palace stones, sleeping light and dreaming loud. You whistled near it at your own risk. Now, was any of this written into formal law? Not always. But the cultural weight of it ensured compliance. In a world where ritual and reputation ruled, no one wanted to be the guy who broke a 1,000-year-old taboo just to hum a tune. Especially not if that tune came back to you slightly different, like it had learned something on the way. Let's also take a quick detour into clothing because yes, even your wardrobe mattered in this world of sonic etiquette. At night, especially during formal observances, courtiers wore softer shoes, layered sleeves, and fabrics that muffled movement. Everything about you was expected to contribute to the quiet. If your robes swished too loudly, you were seen as undisciplined. So, a whistle. That wasn't just loud, it was a full-blown personality crisis. And of course, we can't forget the astrologers and court diviners who were especially wary of sound. These were the folks who advised kings based on celestial patterns, and they believed certain planetary alignments heightened the permeability between realms. During these times, sound carried farther, not just across the air, but across realities. Whistling during such a period wasn't just unlucky, it was reckless. You didn't want to open the sky's ear without knowing what might lean in to listen. So here you are, now imagining yourself as a low-ranking palace scribe, carefully making your way across the stone courtyard after curfew. The moonlight glints off the lacquered trim of your robe. You think of whistling a joke, a test, but then you remember the silence demanded by ancestors' laws and legends, and you think better of it. You nod to the night guards who respond with a faint shuffle of their boots. No words. No sound. Just the shared understanding that quiet is safety. That some melodies are better left unsung. You pass under the shadow of the palace wall, stepping back into the realm of ordinary folk. But even here the echo of royal silence follows. Even now, hundreds of years later, if you listen closely, really closely, you might still hear it. Or not. Probably best not to whistle and find out. The moon sits higher now, bathing the old village in that cool, silvery hush that makes shadows seem deeper than they really are. You pass by a stone wall lined with clay pots, ongi jars, sealed tight with straw lids, holding fermented pastes and pickles. But in this light they look like rows of squat little spirits, each one waiting patiently for morning. And somewhere behind those walls, tucked away from the wind, a grandmother hums a lullaby, but never whistles it. That's because even music, that most human of comforts, knew where to draw the line. Traditional Korean music is elegant, complex, and deeply tied to nature and emotion. Instruments like the gyeogyum or daegum produce soft bending notes that mimic the wind water or voice. Shamanic chants, folk songs, and even royal processions all followed certain tonal rules. But But across these genres, one thing remains strangely consistent: whistling doesn't belong. Let's start with the most sacred of musical expressions, shamanic chanting. A gut ceremony led by a mudang could last hours, sometimes days. It was filled with percussive rhythms, trance-like singing and ritual dances meant to bridge the human world with the spirit realm. The mudang's voice would waver between sobbing chants and ecstatic shouts, but never once would she whistle. Why? Because according to law, whistling was unpredictable. It wasn't bound to language, to ritual patterns, or even to the drumbeat. It was sound unchained, and in a ceremony designed to invite in specific spirits and repel others, you don't want to send out a mixed signal, especially not one that might summon something with no name and no business being there. Even in folk traditions where music served more playful or narrative functions, whistling was largely absent. You might find children singing songs about spinning tops or field workers chanting tunes to ease the planting, but the sound of a whistle was treated with suspicion. In many rural communities, people believed that whistling in a rice paddy could anger the field spirits, or worse, invite snakes into the crop rows. And remember, in Korea, even the soil had memory. Farmers who respected the land didn't make casual noise near it, especially after dusk. One fringe but fascinating theory says that whistling was avoided in musical culture because it competed too directly with the wind itself. Korea is a peninsula, after all, bordered by restless seas and carved with winding valleys. The wind had its own voice, and it was considered sacred, sometimes a messenger, sometimes a warning. To whistle over it was like speaking over an elder, rude at best, dangerous at worst. This reverence extended even into lullabies, which might seem like the perfect place for a whistle-like melodic soothing. But in Korean jaljayo songs you hear soft vowels, repeated rhythms, gentle sways. A mother's voice dips and curls like silk in water. She doesn't whistle because she's not just singing to the child, she's singing to whatever else might be listening. A lullaby, in old Korean belief, wasn't just for comfort. It was a protective charm, a sonic boundary that wrapped the child in human warmth and pushed other things away. Insert a whistle and the boundary breaks. In fact, some lullabies contain coded warnings. One of the oldest Bari Gongju tells the story of a princess abandoned at birth, raised by commoners who journeys to the underworld to retrieve medicine for her dying parents. It's beautiful, tragic, and just a little terrifying. It's the kind of story that reminds a child that the worlds of the living and the dead aren't so far apart. Singing it gently keeps those worlds in balance. Whistling it, that would be like knocking on the underworld's front door. Even the pansori, Korea's epic storytelling music performed by a single singer and drummer, avoided whistling. A pansori performer might laugh, cry, growl, or even imitate animal calls as part of the performance. But the whistle, that pure piercing tone, it's absent, possibly because it breaks the narrative line, or maybe because it simply didn't feel safe. Pansori is all about emotional connection and moral drama. Whistling has no moral arc, it's just there, unanchored. There's also a practical theory. In communal or ritual settings, a whistle could be confused with a warning call. In mountain communities, a sharp whistle meant danger, often a signal for wild animals, invading forces, or fire. To insert that sound into a musical context was to blur the line between performance and alarm. Nobody wants grandma's funeral turning into a bear drill, right? Of course, not all music was so serious. Korea had drinking songs, harvest chants, even playful melodies performed at village festivals. But even here, whistling was usually left to jesters or troublemakers in tales, not real performers. A whistling character in a folk story was often foolish, arrogant, or about to meet something they shouldn't. Think of it as the ancient Korean equivalent of yelling, "I'll be right back" in a horror movie. Not great odds. Modern scholars still discuss why whistling never took hold in traditional Korean soundscapes. Some suggest it's because Korea developed a particularly refined musical vocabulary that emphasized texture and nuance over piercing tones. Others believe the taboo came first and musicians simply adapted around it. And some more mysteriously inclined wonder if early artists understood something we've forgotten, that sound is a bridge, and some bridges aren't meant to be walked after dark. So now as you pass a small house where a father strums a geomungo for his half-asleep daughter, you hear the twang of strings, the gentle pat of her feet against the ondol floor, but not a whistle. Never a whistle. Because in this culture, in this quiet music, wasn't just beauty, it was order, memory, protection, a net cast over the unknown. You don't need to whistle. The wind has its song. The pine branches brush the air in rhythm. Somewhere, an owl hoots, a 3-beat call answered by the creak of an old wooden beam. That's the music of night in old Korea. And it's enough. You turn down a broader path now, one that curves past what was once a government outpost. The gate is still there, stone pillars leaning in their surfaces etched faintly by moss and time. Somewhere behind those walls, night guards once patrolled with slow steps and sharper ears. And oddly enough, this is where whistling was allowed. Sort of. Because while everyone else was taught to keep their lips tightly sealed after dark, there was one group who defied the rule with a whistle, the Night Watchers. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it, after all this talk of summoning spirits, of disturbing wind gods and provoking serpents, now suddenly state-sanctioned whistling. But yes, in some parts of Joseon-era Korea, particularly in larger settlements and cities like Hanyang modern-day Seoul, night guards known as podochong, or sometimes just yakgyong, used specific whistling sounds as part of their nightly rounds. Of course, this wasn't freestyle whistling. This wasn't someone casually walking past a rice shop humming a tune through their teeth. No, this was structured, purposeful, codified even, and above all, ritualized. The whistle was a tool, like a bell, like a drum. It had function, it had rules. The guards used whistles or other sharp sounds, sometimes tapping sticks or rhythmic clappers, to announce their position at intervals. This served several purposes. It reassured citizens that the area was under watch, signaled to other guards in distant lanes, and acted as a mild deterrent to anyone thinking of mischief. But here's the twist: people didn't necessarily feel reassured by the sound. In fact, some sources suggest that people still flinched a little when they heard it, because a whistle, especially at night, still meant something unnatural had entered the silence. The irony is thick, isn't it? The very sound that peasants feared would call ghosts was now being used to guard against, well, presumably thieves and fire, but perhaps also ghosts. Let's not rule anything out. Historians still argue about the scope of this whistle use. Some claim it was more of a bell or wooden clacker, with the whistling stories added later for drama. Others believe the guards genuinely whistled, but only in specific tones or intervals that differed from natural human tunes. Think sharp-clipped signals like Morse code for ghost-fearing Confucians. Even so, the guards themselves often treated their tools with ritual caution. One folktale from a border village tells of a young night guard who improvised a playful tune during his patrol, just for fun. The next morning, villagers awoke to find all the doors along his route hanging open. No sign of forced entry. Just wide, yawning houses, as if something had strolled politely in. The guard was never seen again. Did he leave? Was he taken? Did he whistle himself right into someone else's dream? You can guess which version the elders favored. In larger cities, curfews were common. Drums marked the hours, and citizens were expected to be indoors long before the deepest parts of the night. Guards were often instructed not to make eye contact, not to speak unnecessarily, and yes, to avoid whistling unless it was part of the official signal. Even then, they were encouraged to keep it minimal. And in rural regions where night watch duties rotated between villagers, many simply refused to whistle at all. Too risky. Here's a quirky detail: in some areas, instead of whistles, night watchers carried small metal rattles filled with pebbles. They would shake them lightly as they walked, just enough to announce themselves, but not enough to stir the sleeping spirits. It was a gentler kind of noise, a compromise, you could say, between order and tradition, between the need for safety and the fear of sound. One recorded Confucian commentary even criticized these practices, saying that unnecessary noise at night invited misfortune from unseen domains. The writer didn't say ghosts outright. Of course, Confucians had reputations to protect, but everyone reading it knew exactly what he meant. because even in writing, even among scholars, the fear of nighttime sound never fully left. And then there's the emotional side. For the average person lying on a straw mat inside their wooden home, hearing a whistle, official or not, in the middle of the night was unsettling. It could mean a guard on patrol, or it could mean something less uniformed. Some said that if you heard a whistle more than once, or if it seemed to move too quickly from one side of the house to another, you shouldn't get up to look. You should just turn over, pull the blanket tighter, and wait until morning. Because once you saw the source of the sound, if it wasn't a person, then it saw you too. And seeing in ghost stories always goes both ways. Even today, older folks in some parts of Korea might still reference the patrol's whistle when explaining sudden chills or strange dreams. It's become a kind of euphemism, less about security, more about the things that pass by unnoticed, making just enough sound to remind you that the world isn't always yours after midnight. So here you are, now standing at the edge of the old road where guards once walked, clutching their torches and trying not to whistle unless they absolutely had to. You imagine their path, the slow crunch of gravel, the occasional rattle of keys, the glint of metal under moonlight. You imagine the sound they made, just enough to mark their passage, just enough to warn or summon. And again you keep your own lips still. Not because you're afraid, but because now you understand. In a world where silence meant safety, every sound was a decision. And some decisions weren't worth making lightly. The night deepens. The last glow from lanterns has gone out. Only the stars remain now, watching from above. And beneath them, the whistle of the wind, no guards this time, no patrols, just the rustling of old pine needles and your footsteps soft and careful on the path. You leave the watch path behind and follow a narrow trail that winds past an old schoolhouse, the kind with wooden beams polished smooth by generations of palms and sandals. The door stands open, creaking gently in the night breeze, and inside you can just make out the low outline of a chalkboard and a few straw mats for seating. You stand quietly at the threshold. No ghosts here, just knowledge. Maybe. And what better way to explore knowledge than through poetry? Yes, tonight's hush isn't just for the practical or the spiritual. It also lived in the realm of Korean poetry. In particular, seijo poetry. This deceptively simple form, usually 3 lines long with an internal rhythm and moral twist, was the favorite of Confucian scholars, retired officials, and wandering poets alike. The seijo is like a breath held between thought and emotion, dense, elegant, structured, and in all its lyricism it rarely ever whistles. Think about that. A form so closely tied to emotion, to beauty, to the human experience, yet whistling, that fleeting melodic exhale is nowhere to be found. It's almost an accidental absence, the kind you don't notice until you realize it never arrives. There are sighs, there are groans, there are cries of longing and joy, but no whistles. Why? Some literary historians believe this omission reflects the deeper cultural tone of the Joseon dynasty, a time when restraint both in life and art was admired. Emotion was not to be displayed freely, it was to be managed. A well-crafted seijo might mourn a lost lover, but it would do so with philosophical resignation, not wild keening. A father might lament his son's departure, but he'd express it through a metaphor about falling leaves, not a shriek into the night air. And a whistle would be chaos. It wouldn't belong. In some stories, whistling is the act of those outside the social order. Bandits whistle from hilltops to signal attacks. Drunken men whistle to mock authority. Lost spirits whistle from rooftops to lure travelers off course. The seijo poet was none of these. He was the opposite, dignified, orderly, and bound by the rhythms of nature and duty. Whistling would have broken the music of the form. It would have made noise instead of meaning. There's a strange little folk tale tucked away in the outskirts of Gyeongsang province about a would-be poet who couldn't help but whistle as he composed. The villagers avoided him, believing he wasn't writing poetry at all, but transcribing ghost speech. The man claimed that his verses came from the hills carried to him on the wind, but every time he finished a seijo, it read backwards, literally. The characters reversed. Scholars came from miles around to examine the phenomenon, and one monk suggested burning the scrolls before the ink dried. The poet vanished soon after. Did he whistle his way into the mountain's mouth? No one says. But the story ends with a new saying born in that village: ink listens. Think about that next time you doodle something creepy. This quiet avoidance of whistling in poetry wasn't just structural, it was psychological. To whistle was to show presence, to announce the self. But seijo, and by extension much of Korean literature, is filled with the tension between being and vanishing. The form loves dusk-fading lanterns, last leaves, final words. It's an aesthetic that says, I am here briefly. A whistle is too bold, too sharp. It breaks the mood. It refuses to fade. There's a particularly well-known seijo by Yi Hwang, also known as toigye, one of Korea's most revered Confucian scholars. It speaks of the wind stirring the pine trees at night, how their needles clatter softly, like an old man's prayer beads. It's haunting, beautiful. But there is no suggestion of a whistle, only the sound of things that belong in the dark. Controlled, delicate, respectful. Almost as if the poet knew, add one piercing note and the entire landscape would shift. Modern readers have looked at this absence and wondered, could it be that whistling was just considered too ordinary for poetry? Possibly. But then again, seijo doesn't shy away from the ordinary. There are poems about farming tools, birds on windowsills, even a scholar's disappointment with his dinner. So no, it wasn't the simplicity of the sound, it was the threat it carried, the disruption, the invitation. Even in more experimental modern Korean poetry, you'll rarely find a character whistling with joy. If someone does whistle, it's either in defiance or loneliness. There's a wonderful post-war poem that describes a boy whistling into an empty rice field, hoping to hear his brother's return from war. But the echo he hears is just the wind replying, not voice, not footstep. That echo is meant to break your heart. The whistle in that poem isn't music, it's grief. That's the thing with whistling in Korean cultural memory. It's always one note away from danger, or sorrow, or both. So here you are, now standing just outside the old schoolhouse, wondering whether the scholars who once passed through these doors ever dared to whistle their way home. Probably not. They were taught to pause at the edge of sound, to choose silence over disruption, to write their sorrows, not sing them, not sing. And as you move on, stepping softly into the next curve of the road, the echo of that restraint follows you. Not as silence, but as something more meaningful, like the pause between lines in a poem. You can almost feel it, the weight of everything, not said, everything held back for the sake of peace, of poetry, of not waking whatever else sleeps beneath this timeless sky. The road begins to narrow again, curving into a cluster of older homes, low wide structures, with roof tiles layered like scales, sagging ever so slightly under their own age. Here, everything seems half asleep. The air is still, the night insects chirp lazily, and somewhere behind a door the soft clack of wooden game pieces on a stone board marks a quiet midnight diversion. But even here in the softest corners of the village no one whistles. And if you ask why, someone might answer with a story, not a sermon, not a rule, just a story, because sometimes those are more powerful. Korea has always been a land of storytellers. Before print, before electric lights, before the hum of radios or the glow of TVs, there were tales, spoken tales, tales shaped by firelight and winter winds and the hush of expectant listeners, and among them, tales of those who whistled at night and the things that whistled back. One of the oldest comes from the southern coast, near a fishing village where the wind never seemed to stop. The story tells of a boy named Jiho, who despite warnings from his grandmother, loved to whistle. He'd do it while gathering firewood, while herding goats, even as he walked alone past the burial mounds outside the village. The elders warned him that such sounds called things out of the hills, things that had no eyes, no mouths, but long memories. One night, during the first frost of winter, Jiho vanished. No one heard a scream, no signs of struggle, just his footprints leading into the woods and a second set, smaller, deeper, following. Some say it was a fox spirit. Others claim it was a gwishin, a ghost bride seeking a companion in death. But all agreed on one thing: she had followed his whistle. That tale's been retold 1,000 ways. Sometimes Jiho's a girl, sometimes it's a mountain, not a forest. Sometimes the ending is hopeful, he comes back, changed. Mostly, though, he doesn't come back at all, because these stories aren't built for redemption. They're built for memory, for warning, and they work. Even now you'll meet elders who recall being hushed by grandparents when they dared to whistle while playing outside. "Do you want the whistler to hear you?" they'd whisper, eyes darting toward the dark. Who was the whistler? Depends who you ask. A ghost, a trickster, a thing with no feet that rides the fog. It doesn't matter, the name was enough. The silence that followed that was the real story. One fringe tale, less well known but far stranger, comes from the mountainous regions near the border of Old Baekje territory. It tells of a cursed cave sealed off by a rock slide where monks once practiced forbidden chants. A young traveller, hearing rumours, decided to spend the night outside its entrance. For company, or perhaps out of boredom, he began to whistle. After the third note, the wind reversed. The trees bent toward him. And from the cave came a sound, not a whistle exactly, but its opposite, like breath being sucked back into stone. He ran, of course, but they say he aged 10 years by morning, and his shadow never quite caught up with him. Historians predictably are split on the origins of these stories. Some argue they emerged from legitimate fears, wild animals, bandits, natural echoes mistaken for replies. Others think they served as social teaching tools, metaphorical boundaries meant to keep children close to home, women indoors after dusk, and restless young men out of trouble. Whistling at night brings ghosts, they'd say, but what they really meant was stop tempting fate. Still others, mostly folklorists with long beards and longer patience, see deeper layers. They argue that whistling isn't just about summoning, it's about agency. In these stories, the whistler starts something, they initiate a call, they challenge the quiet. And the universe, being old, mysterious, and not overly fond of upstarts, answers back. It's also worth noting that many ghost stories in Korea don't involve loud hauntings. There are few chains rattling, few poltergeists. Instead, the ghosts linger at the edge of perception. Cold drafts, dreams out of order, objects just slightly moved. In such a world, a whistle is too loud, too definite. It draws attention, and attention is never what you want from something that lives between the walls of sound and silence. Let's not forget the gumiho, the nine-tailed fox of Korean myth. A shapeshifter often appearing as a beautiful woman, she's said to lure victims through charm and sometimes sound. There's one version where a soldier hears a haunting whistle on the wind, follows it into the trees, and is found days later with no memory, only fox fur clinging to his uniform. Was it just a breeze, or did the fox borrow his own whistle to lure the next one? Even in comedy, the theme persists. There are jokes in some 20th century villages that if you hear a whistle while relieving yourself at night, you should apologize, not for what you're doing, but for disturbing whoever else was already there. Ghosts, it turns out, are very particular about bathroom etiquette. These stories, passed down in markets, temples, and smoky village kitchens, became a kind of oral fence, a boundary drawn with words instead of walls. You didn't need to write a law about whistling. You just needed one good story, and people would remember. So as you walk now past homes where entire generations once slept through storm and invasion, famine and festival, you feel the gravity of those stories. Not in fear exactly, but in awareness. You don't feel alone, you feel watched. Not in a threatening way, more like the way a field watches the wind or how an old house listens to its own creaks. You are not the first to pass this road, and you won't be the last. And that's the beauty of these stories. They're not warnings in the sense of danger. They're invitations to walk carefully, to listen more closely, to treat sound as something sacred. A whisper in the right place, a silence in the right time, a step that doesn't echo, These are the behaviors that survive. So you move on deeper into the village, past the ancient hearths and sleeping dogs, past everything old and still. And though the road is empty, the air is full. With stories, with warnings, with old echoes, and not a single whistle. You've wandered deep now into the heart of this night, where time feels like it's folded gently over itself, where it's no longer clear whether you're walking through memory or memory is walking through you. And in this strange stillness, a question arises: was Korea alone in its fear of the nighttime whistle? You pause, looking up at the moon, nestled among ink-black clouds, and the answer drifts in from beyond the mountains. No, this hush is not just Korean. You're not the only one who's ever been told to stay quiet after dark. Across Asia, scattered like pearls on a thread, other cultures carry their own variations of the whistling taboo. In Japan, for example, there's the saying, "Yoru ni kuchibue o fukuto hebi ga deru." If you whistle at night, a snake will come. Sound familiar? It's nearly identical to the Korean warning. The difference is that in some Japanese regions, the snake is said to take human form, sometimes a ghost, sometimes a demon, sometimes a lost child who never stopped looking for its mother. It's creepy, yes, but also strangely tender. Like most ghost stories, it's about what lingers. In Okinawan folklore, whistling at night might not summon a snake, but instead attracts malevolent spirits that can possess or mislead the living. One folktale tells of a fisherman who whistled to pass the time on a moonless beach. What came out of the tide wasn't a fish. Let's just say he dropped his rod and ran screaming into the hills, never to fish again. The lesson: keep your tunes to yourself when the sea forgets its moon. Over in China particularly, in older Han beliefs, whistling was also frowned upon after dark, particularly near cemeteries or ancestral temples. The belief there focused more on ghosts being confused or worse, invited by the sound. Some even said it mimicked the calling of the dead. A sharp whistle could summon wandering souls who thought someone had called their name. Others believed whistling created a sonic rift in the qi of a place, the vital energy of a location, disrupting its balance and opening it to misfortune. You weren't just being rude, you were punching a hole in the atmosphere. In Mongolia, a culture deeply tied to steppe winds and shamanic traditions, whistling at night was also taboo. There, the belief was tied to spirits of the wind, ethereal forces that could be benevolent or wrathful. Whistling could be interpreted as mocking them. And mocking spirits on the open steppe, bad idea. The wind, after all, was not just a natural force, it was a pathway. Shamans used it to send messages between worlds. If you whistled without purpose, you might send a message you didn't mean to. Or worse, get a reply. Even further south, in parts of Southeast Asia like Thailand and the Philippines, night whistling is treated with suspicion. In Thai folklore, a whistle after dark might invite a fire ghost, especially one tied to unresolved trauma or vengeance. Some say it's the sound that draws them in, while others believe whistling imitates the signal spirits use to communicate among themselves. Either way, you're now part of the conversation, and not the kind with tea and biscuits. And what about Vietnam, just across Korea's southern border by sea? Among its rich traditions of ancestor worship and spirit houses, you'll find similar warnings. Some Vietnamese elders say whistling at night can wake the hungry ghosts, those not fed. In ritual, those who linger between incense trails, they may not hurt you, but they'll follow you home. And then the house feels wrong even in daylight. You spill water for no reason. You wake up facing the wrong way. Your cat won't look at you. The little things that let you know something else is there. So why do these beliefs echo across so many cultures, so many languages? Historians still argue whether they're remnants of a shared prehistoric tradition or simply parallel evolutions, separate cultures arriving at the same truth through the same experience. Sound, after all, behaves the same across the world. A whistle in a forest is sharp, sudden, easy to misplace. It bounces, it travels, it returns warped. No wonder it feels uncanny. You're not just hearing your own sound, you're hearing the world react to it. That reaction, that's where the stories live. There's also something inherently eerie about high-pitched noises at night. Think about it. Most comforting sounds are low and warm. A crackling fire, a soft hum, a lover's voice under the covers, but a whistle. It cuts. It startles. It feels out of place, like a needle in cotton. In ancient times, when survival hinged on interpreting natural sounds, predators, storms, human intruders, a whistle could be a trigger. Better to fear it than misunderstand it. Of course, some skeptics chalk it all up to coincidence. They argue that night whistling taboos developed independently as ways to reduce noise pollution, avoid animal attacks, or discourage loitering. And sure, maybe that's part of it. But logic doesn't explain why so many people across so many landscapes still glance over their shoulders when they hear a whistle after dusk. It's as if there's something older than logic stitched into the fabric of the night, something that recognizes patterns even when science doesn't. A shared instinct, a quiet agreement across generations that some sounds don't belong to us and shouldn't be borrowed. So now as you pass beneath an old willow tree drooping gently over the path, you think about all those other people across time who paused in the same way, who felt that same tug of unease, who chose silence not from fear, but from knowing. That kind of knowing that doesn't need a book or a teacher, just the wind and the dark and one breath held a little longer than usual. You're not alone in this hush. You're part of a larger silence, stretching from the mountains of Korea to the temples of Kyoto, the steppes of Mongolia to the riverbanks of Thailand. A network of nights stitched together by the absence of one small sound. And isn't that beautiful, that a world so large, so scattered, could agree on something as simple as this: don't whistle after dark. The path tilts upward now, gently at first, then, with the steady insistence of an old trail, reclaiming its climb. You find yourself stepping between tree roots, past stone lanterns and fading totems, deeper into the hills above the village. The breeze has picked up, not strong but purposeful, and it whistles through the pine needles without needing your help. It's the kind of wind that carries thoughts. And tonight, it carries a debate, one that's quietly persisted for centuries. Why really did so many people across time and place believe whistling at night was dangerous? What does it mean when sound becomes taboo? Historians, anthropologists, and folklorists all have their theories, of course. And like most good arguments, none are quite wrong, but none feel entirely right either. Still, let's walk through them slowly, carefully, like picking our way through undergrowth that might conceal something sleeping just beneath the surface. One of the more grounded theories ties whistling to disease avoidance. In pre-modern societies, nighttime was dangerous not just spiritually but physically. It was when predators prowled, when the cold set in, when illness spread more easily in crowded, unventilated homes. If you discouraged loud sounds after dark, especially sharp, sudden ones, you could be preserving not just peace but health. Some even suggested that high-pitched sounds could trigger coughing fits in those with respiratory problems, or agitate livestock, disturbing sleep rhythms for entire households. Whistling in this view becomes a vector, a disturbance to equilibrium. There's also the social order angle. Confucian Korea was a highly stratified society. Everything from clothing to walking routes was regulated. Quiet was a sign of discipline, and discipline was virtue. To whistle after dark was to reject the script, to say, I exist outside this order. And that made you dangerous, or if not dangerous, then at least unpredictable. And what's more unnerving than unpredictability in the dead of night? Another theory is rooted in psychological projection, the idea that we fear our own voice when it's unreturned. Imagine standing alone whistling into the dark and something whistles back. You're unsure if it's an echo. You hope it's an echo. But if it isn't, you've just been answered. And answers, especially unsolicited ones, are rarely comforting in folklore. Even modern psychology supports this unease. Humans are hardwired to be alert to unnatural sound patterns. A baby crying in the night, terrifying even when you know what it is. A whistle, with its clean tonal edge, mimics distress signals. Your body doesn't interpret it as music, it interprets it as interruption. Your heart speeds up, your hearing sharpens. You listen for footsteps that may not come. In a way, the old taboos were early forms of self-regulation. Community built boundaries to keep the brain from spiraling too far into nocturnal anxiety. But then we come to the more liminal explanations, the ones that tiptoe up to the edge of rational thought and peer over. These suggest that the whistling taboo isn't about health order or even fear, it's about boundary violation. In many traditional cosmologies, Korean included, the world was not a flat contained map. It was layered, intersecting. The realms of the living, the dead, the divine, and the wild all shared overlapping borders. These realms had their own rules, their own hours, their own expectations. Daytime was for the living. Night, that was shared space, liminal time. A time when boundaries grew thin and sound traveled strangely. Whistling then wasn't just a noise, it was a gesture, a kind of knock on the membrane between here and elsewhere. That's why so many stories tie nighttime whistling to spirits, not because they feared the sound itself, but because the sound suggested an opening, a thinning, a reach across the veil. And when you view it that way, even the act of telling someone not to whistle becomes a kind of cultural spell, a small but persistent protection. An unspoken way of saying, stay on your side. Let them stay on theirs. But even among scholars, there's no final consensus. Some brush the entire tradition off as folk panic driven by a few high-profile tales that snowballed into cultural norms. Others argue it's a palimpsest, layers of belief, practicality, and spiritual anxiety all etched atop one another, till the original reason is unknowable. Still, no one's ever been able to explain why people keep passing it down. Ask a Korean elder about night whistling today, and you'll get a smile, maybe a chuckle, but also a pause, a hesitation. That moment before they say, well, I don't really believe it, but still, I wouldn't do it. That but still carries weight. It's the echo of 100 generations saying the same thing in different words. It's cultural muscle memory, like touching wood after tempting fate, or glancing over your shoulder when someone says your name in an empty room. And then, of course, there are those who've tested the rule, the brave, the bored, the skeptics. Some whistle just to see, to challenge the idea, and most of them report nothing. Silence, maybe an odd gust of wind, maybe the unsettling way their own sound bounces back to them from a rock they didn't notice. But some tell other stories. A student in Seoul once posted on a forum about whistling outside a rural guest house just for fun. Within 5 minutes, the electricity flickered. An hour later, his friend vomited blood. Coincidence maybe, but ask that student if he's whistled at night since. So now here you are, walking higher into the forest's edge, the sky opening just a little between branches. The stars seem louder up here, the air sharper. You think about whistling, just one note, just to feel it bounce back. You're safe, aren't you? It's 2025. You're educated, you're rational. And still, you don't. Because something about the weight of these stories, these arguments, these generations of caution, makes you realize that the taboo was never about fear. It was about care. Care for the boundary, care for the silence, care for the fragile contract between what walks under the sun and what wanders beneath the moon. So you exhale instead. A quiet breath. The wind takes it. And somewhere far off an owl hoots once low and steady. An answer, but not a reply. The trail begins to descend now, winding between tall pines and patches of fern that glow faintly in the moonlight. It's quieter here, so quiet you can hear your heartbeat if you really listen. Each step is softened by pine needles and old leaves, and the darkness feels less like something looming and more like a gentle hand pressed lightly over your eyes. It's in this hush, this weightless drift of soundlessness, that you begin to understand what ancient Korean monks might have meant when they spoke of sound discipline. Because if there's any place where silence is sacred, it's in the monasteries. Korean Buddhism, with its long history of meditation ritual and nature symbiosis, holds quiet as one of its deepest expressions of respect, not just for the self, but for the world. And within this framework, whistling doesn't just clash, it doesn't belong. In Buddhist monastic life, particularly in the Jogye tradition, The main school of Korean Seon Zen monks followed highly regulated daily schedules. Every moment was accounted for: waking at dawn, chanting sutras, silent meals, meditation, scripture study, physical labor, and walking meditations through the forested grounds. There were times to speak, of course, but they were few, and always intentional. Even footsteps had rhythm. Sandals swept rather than stomped. The doors slid, they didn't slam. Bowls were handled like porcelain infants. You didn't whistle. You didn't need to whistle, because sound wasn't just something made, it was something received. Monks believed that sound had the power to stir the mind, and an undisciplined mind, especially during meditation, was a restless thing like a fly trapped under a rice paper lamp. A sudden whistle could disrupt an entire temple's zazen, pulling others from stillness into confusion. And worse, it could be mistaken as a cry for help, or worse still, as a signal to something unseen. There's a record from Hainsa Temple, one of the most sacred monastic sites in Korea, that references a novice monk who absent-mindedly whistled while sweeping leaves outside the Dharma hall. He didn't mean anything by it, it was just a little trill, something picked up from childhood. But his teacher reprimanded him not with anger, but with this: if the pine tree whistled back, would you stay? A riddle. A warning. A reminder that silence was a place, not just an absence. Interestingly, monks did use sound, but in precise, deliberate forms. Gongs, wooden fish drums, moktak wind chimes in temple eaves, and even bell towers rung at dawn and dusk. These were not just noises, they were calls to awareness, symbolic thresholds between one task and another, between one moment of being and the next. Every note had intention. It was sound as offering. And that's what made whistling, with its casual, uncontrolled character, feel so inappropriate. It was like spraying perfume in a cathedral. Now, it's true that Buddhist doctrine doesn't specifically ban whistling. It's not a sin. There's no canonical line that says, "Thou shalt not tooteth thine own horn." But in the lived tradition of Korean monastic life, it simply wasn't done. It was considered undignified, unfocused. It distracted from samadhi, the meditative absorption monks spent their whole lives pursuing. There's a curious little fringe tale from a mountainside hermitage near Gangjin. A monk alone for decades was said to never speak, never write, never even open his eyes fully. But at midnight, villagers said they could sometimes hear a single high note drift from the forest, thin, sharp, unmistakably a whistle. Was it him? Was it a spirit? The story never says. But one year during the Lotus Lantern Festival, someone dared to follow the sound. They found no monk, just a robe neatly folded, and a pile of pine cones stacked with mathematical precision. Make of that what you will. More concretely, in the temple schools where young monks trained, mindfulness was taught through silence. A student might be asked to walk across a gravel courtyard blindfolded, listening for the sound of his own feet. He might be told to serve a meal in absolute quiet, aware of every grain of rice. And if he whistled, he'd start over. Because in this environment, silence wasn't a punishment, it was the medium of practice. Historians suggest that the culture of silence in Buddhist monasteries influenced the larger Korean taboo on nighttime noise. As Buddhism spread through the peninsula during the Three Kingdoms period and into the unified Silla and Goryeo dynasties, its values permeated more than just theology. They filtered into education, governance, and even etiquette. The ideal scholar became a hybrid figure, Confucian, by training Buddhist in bearing, restrained, humble, quiet. It's no surprise then that the folk prohibition against whistling at night found its roots strengthened in this soil. Not just because of fear, but because silence was a shared language, spoken by monks and mountains, ghosts and ancestors. You didn't interrupt that language lightly. Even today, visitors to Korean temples are reminded to walk slowly, to speak softly, to respect the stillness of the grounds. If you wander through Beomyosa or Bulguksa in the late evening, if you're lucky enough to be there at closing, you'll feel it. That almost palpable hush, that breath held in sacred patience. You won't want to whistle, it won't even occur to you. Because silence in these places isn't emptiness, it's attention, it's presence, It's the world listening back. So you continue your path downward, now the temple roofs far above and behind you, the forest slowly opening into softer hills. You feel lighter somehow. Not just because of the descent, but because something has settled inside you. A sense of reverence, of stillness, of shared quiet. You could whistle. There's no one here to stop you. But then again, maybe there is. The slope levels out now, the trees thinning as the village reappears below, just rooftops and chimneys, at first scattered like spilled ink across the valley. You recognize a few: the granary with its clay tiles, the schoolhouse near the bend, the narrow alley where you first noticed the hush. But something's changed since you began your walk. The silence no longer feels like a warning, it feels like tradition. It feels like something worn smooth over generations. And just as you're feeling this quiet settle into your bones, the story shifts again. Because even silence has its end. And in Korea's story, the end of silence came not with a scream, but with colonialism. It's impossible to talk about the decline of many ancient Korean beliefs, including the whistling taboo, without addressing the seismic disruption of Japanese occupation. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was colonized by the Japanese Empire, and in those decades, nearly every aspect of Korean life was upended. Language, land ownership, education, religious practice, and even the calendar were all forcibly altered. And with that, so too were customs, the quiet rules, the unspoken boundaries, the ancestral whispers. The occupiers brought with them their own traditions, many of which clashed with Korea's. While Japan had its own version of night whistling taboos, particularly in rural areas, the imperial system that governed Korea did not respect or preserve these beliefs. In fact, much of the occupation strategy involved erasing local identities. Folk customs were labeled as backward, monasteries were stripped of land, shamanism was mocked or outright banned in some areas. Schools began teaching Japanese songs, Japanese etiquette, and Japanese values. Whistling, like many other minor daily habits, began to shift under this pressure. In cities, especially where Japanese police patrolled and new infrastructure emerged, the taboos started to fade. Whistling was no longer viewed as spiritually dangerous, it was viewed as irrelevant, outdated. It became something only the elderly remembered with a flinch. There are first-hand accounts from elders who recalled being punished in school for speaking Korean, let alone maintaining folk practices. One woman from Jeolla province described how her grandmother would still scold her for whistling on the way home, even as her teacher told her it was just noise. That conflict between the old voice and the new law became a defining tension in 20th century Korean identity. And yet the belief didn't vanish. Not entirely. It retreated into rural villages, into bedtime stories, into the low voice of a mother who still told her children, "We don't do that at night." The words may have changed, softened, become less certain, but the rhythm stayed. After liberation in 1945, Korea entered a period of immense upheaval, division war, rebuilding, rapid modernization. Cities grew, neon lights replaced lanterns, radios and televisions brought new soundscapes into homes. Whistling became just another background noise, something in movies and American songs in city streets filled with cars and life. The idea that it could summon ghosts seemed almost quaint, but not everyone forgot. In the 1970s, during a revival of interest in Korean heritage and identity, researchers began collecting oral histories from rural elders. Among them, the night whistling taboo appeared again and again. Different regions had different stories, different spirits, different rules, but the caution remained. You could almost chart it like a fading constellation, each village a blinking star in a map of inherited silence. Some sociologists argue that the loss of this belief is a symptom of something deeper, a disconnection from nature, from ancestral rhythms, from community rituals that once bound people not just to each other, but to the land itself. When night no longer scares us, they say we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop belonging. Others are more optimistic. They see the shift as an evolution, not a loss, but a change. Today, young Koreans might not flinch at a whistle, but many still light incense for their ancestors. They still bow on Lunar New Year. They still dream about old villages even if they live in skyscrapers now. Maybe the ghosts are quieter, but they haven't gone. And even in the realm of art, the old rules echo. In some Korean horror films, for instance, a character might whistle at night, and it's always a signal, a foreshadow, a crack in the logic of the world. The audience may not know the full history, but they feel it, as that's the power of folklore. It doesn't need to be believed to be effective, it just needs to linger. One fringe artist in the 1990s even created a sound installation based on the taboo. He traveled to mountain temples and rural hamlets recording ambient night sounds. In each location, he whistled once, then waited. The recordings captured wind-water bird calls and once an unexplained answering tone. No echo. Just something. The piece was called Don't Wake the Pines. So now you descend back into the village where a few lights still burn behind curtained windows. You hear music soft and electronic drifting from a cracked door. Somewhere a motorbike coughs to life. This is a different world than the one you started in. But as you pass an old courtyard, you notice an elder sitting by the hearth, a cat curled at his feet, a pipe in his hand. He hums, taps his slipper against the stone. But when the wind picks up and the night deepens, he falls silent, listens, watches the shadows, and does not whistle. Because some silences, no matter how deep they're buried, always find a way to surface, especially when the night leans in. The slope levels out now, the trees thinning as the village reappears below, just rooftops and chimneys, at first scattered like spilled ink across the valley. You recognize a few: the granary with its clay tiles, the schoolhouse near the bend, the narrow alley where you first noticed the hush. But something's changed since you began your walk. The silence no longer feels like a warning, it feels like tradition. It feels like something worn smooth over generations. And just as you're feeling this quiet settle into your bones, the story shifts again. Because even silence has its end. And in Korea's story, the end of silence came not with a scream, but with colonialism. It's impossible to talk about the decline of many ancient Korean beliefs, including the whistling taboo, without addressing the seismic disruption of Japanese occupation. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was colonized by the Japanese Empire, and in those decades, nearly every aspect of Korean life was upended. Language, land ownership, education, religious practice, and even the calendar were all forcibly altered. And with that, so too were customs, the quiet rules, the unspoken boundaries, the ancestral whispers. The occupiers brought with them their own traditions, many of which clashed with Korea's. While Japan had its own version of night whistling taboos, particularly in rural areas, the imperial system that governed Korea did not respect or preserve these beliefs. In fact, much of the occupation strategy involved erasing local identities. Folk customs were labeled as backward, monasteries were stripped of land, shamanism was mocked or outright banned in some areas. Schools began teaching Japanese songs, Japanese etiquette, and Japanese values. Whistling, like many other minor daily habits, began to shift under this pressure. In cities, especially where Japanese police patrolled and new infrastructure emerged, the taboo started to fade. Whistling was no longer viewed as spiritually dangerous, it was viewed as irrelevant, outdated. It became something only the elderly remembered with a flinch. There are first-hand accounts from elders who recalled being punished in school for speaking Korean, let alone maintaining folk practices. One woman from Jeolla province described how her grandmother would still scold her for whistling on the way home, even as her teacher told her it was just noise. That conflict between the old voice and the new law became a defining tension in 20th century Korean identity. And yet the belief didn't vanish. Not entirely. It retreated. Into rural villages, into bedtime stories, into the low voice of a mother who still told her children, "We don't do that at night." The words may have changed, softened, become less certain, but the rhythm stayed. After liberation in 1945, Korea entered a period of immense upheaval, division war, rebuilding, rapid modernization. Cities grew, neon lights replaced lanterns, radios and televisions brought new soundscapes into homes. Whistling became just another background noise, something in movies, in American songs, in city streets filled with cars and life. The idea that it could summon ghosts seemed almost quaint, but not everyone forgot. In the 1970s, during a revival of interest in Korean heritage and identity, researchers began collecting oral histories from rural elders. Among them, the night whistling taboo appeared again and again. Different regions had different stories, different spirits, different rules, but the caution remained. You could almost chart it like a fading constellation, each village a blinking star in a map of inherited silence. Some sociologists argue that the loss of this belief is a symptom of something deeper, a disconnection from nature, from ancestral rhythms, from community rituals that once bound people not just to each other, but to the land itself. When night no longer scares us, they say we stop listening, and when we stop listening, we stop belonging. Others are more optimistic. They see the shift as an evolution, not a loss, but a change. Today, young Koreans might not flinch at a whistle, but many still light incense for their ancestors. They still bow on Lunar New Year. They still dream about old villages, even if they live in skyscrapers now. Maybe the ghosts are quieter, but they haven't gone. And even in the realm of art, the old rules echo. In some Korean horror films, for instance, a character might whistle at night, and it's always a signal, a foreshadow, a crack in the logic of the world. The audience may not know the full history, but they feel it. That's the power of folklore. It doesn't need to be believed to be effective. It just needs to linger. One fringe artist in the 1990s even created a sound installation based on the taboo. He traveled to mountain temples and rural hamlets, recording ambient night sounds. In each location, he whistled once, then waited. The recordings captured wind-water bird calls and once an unexplained answering tone. No echo, just something. The piece was called Don't Wake the Pines. So now you descend back into the village where a few lights still burn behind curtained windows. You hear music, soft and electronic, drifting from a cracked door. Somewhere, a motorbike coughs to life. This is a different world than the one you started in. But as you pass an old courtyard, you notice an elder sitting by the hearth, a cat curled at his feet, a pipe in his hand. He hums, taps his slipper against the stone. But when the wind picks up and the night deepens, he falls silent, listens, watches the shadows, and does not whistle. Because some silences, no matter how deep they're buried, always find a way to surface. Especially when the night leans in. The slope levels out now, the trees thinning as the village reappears below, just rooftops and chimneys, at first scattered like spilled ink across the valley. You recognize a few, the granary with its clay tiles, the schoolhouse near the bend, the narrow alley where you first noticed the hush. But something's changed since you began your walk. The silence no longer feels like a warning, it feels like tradition. It feels like something worn smooth over generations. And just as you're feeling this quiet settle into your bones, the story shifts again. Because even silence has its end. And in Korea's story, the end of silence came not with a scream, but with colonialism. It's impossible to talk about the decline of many ancient Korean beliefs, including the whistling taboo, without addressing the seismic disruption of Japanese occupation. From 1910 to 1945, Korea was colonized by the Japanese Empire, and in those decades nearly every aspect of Korean life was upended. Language, land ownership, education, religious practice, and even the calendar were all forcibly altered. And with that, so too were customs, the quiet rules, the unspoken boundaries, the ancestral whispers. The occupiers brought with them their own traditions, many of which clashed with Korea's. While Japan had its own version of night whistling taboos, particularly in rural areas, the imperial system that governed Korea did not respect or preserve these beliefs. In fact, much of the occupation strategy involved erasing local identities. Folk customs were labeled as backward, monasteries were stripped of land, shamanism was mocked or outright banned in some areas. Schools began teaching Japanese songs, Japanese etiquette, and Japanese values. Whistling, like many other minor daily habits, began to shift under this pressure. In cities, especially where Japanese police patrolled, and new infrastructure emerged, the taboo started to fade. Whistling was no longer viewed as spiritually dangerous, it was viewed as irrelevant, outdated. It became something only the elderly remembered with a flinch. There are first-hand accounts from elders who recalled being punished in school for speaking Korean, let alone maintaining folk practices. One woman from Jeolla province described how her grandmother would still scold her for whistling on the way home, even as her teacher told her it was just noise. That conflict between the old voice and the new law became a defining tension in 20th century Korean identity. And yet the belief didn't vanish. Not entirely. It retreated. Into rural villages, into bedtime stories, into the low voice of a mother who still told her children, "We don't do that at night." The words may have changed, softened, become less certain, but the rhythm stayed. After liberation in 1945, Korea entered a period of immense upheaval, division war, rebuilding, rapid modernization. Cities grew. Neon lights replaced lanterns, radios and televisions brought new soundscapes into homes. Whistling became just another background noise, something in movies, in American songs, in city streets filled with cars and life. The idea that it could summon ghosts seemed almost quaint, but not everyone forgot. In the 1970s, during a revival of interest in Korean heritage and identity, researchers began collecting oral histories from rural elders. Among them, the night whistling taboo appeared again and again. Different regions had different stories, different spirits, different rules, but the caution remained. You could almost chart it like a fading constellation, each village a blinking star in a map of inherited silence. Some sociologists argue that the loss of this belief is a symptom of something deeper, a disconnection from nature, from ancestral rhythms, from community rituals that once bound people, not just to each other, but to the land itself. When night no longer scares us, they say we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we stop belonging. Others are more optimistic. They see the shift as an evolution, not a loss, but a change. Today, young Koreans might not flinch at a whistle, but many still light incense for their ancestors. They still bow on Lunar New Year. They still dream about old villages, even if they live in skyscrapers now. Maybe the ghosts are quieter, but they haven't gone. And even in the realm of art, the old rules echo. In some Korean horror films, for instance, a character might whistle at night, and it's always a signal, a foreshadow, a crack in the logic of the world. The audience may not know the full history, but they feel it. That's the power of folklore. It doesn't need to be believed to be effective. It just needs to linger. One fringe artist in the 1990s even created a sound installation based on the taboo. He traveled to mountain temples and rural hamlets recording ambient night sounds. In each location, he whistled once, then waited. The recordings captured wind, water, bird calls, and once an unexplained answering tone. No echo, just something. The piece was called "Don't Wake the Pines." So now you descend back into the village where a few lights still burn behind curtained windows. You hear music, soft and electronic, drifting from a cracked door. Somewhere a motorbike coughs to life. This is a different world than the one you started in. But as you pass an old courtyard, you notice an elder sitting by the hearth, a cat curled at his feet, a pipe in his hand. He hums, taps his slipper against the stone. But when the wind picks up and the night deepens, he falls silent, listens, watches the shadows, and does not whistle. Because some silences, no matter how deep they're buried, always find a way to surface, especially when the night leans in. You're nearly back to where you started now, where the road first split, where the old gate leans just slightly to the left, and the path home is no longer a question, but a certainty. But there's one last detour you can't resist, a curve in the village that bends past the oldest houses, the ones half swallowed by trees where moss climbs walls and names are no longer remembered. It's here, in this tangle of roots and roofs, that the modern world gives way to something older, something still alive. Because even today, even with electricity and mobile phones and streetlights, there are places in Korea where the taboo still breathes. Rural Korea has changed dramatically over the past century, But in its quieter corners, the rhythms of life haven't shifted so quickly. There are villages tucked into the folds of mountains, villages where the population is shrinking, where the rice paddies glisten under the same moon their ancestors bowed to, and where the silence after sunset still feels like a conversation you're not supposed to overhear. In these places, whistling at night still raises eyebrows. Not everywhere. Not everyone. But ask the right person. The woman sweeping the shrine, steps at dawn the old man who sells ginseng from his porch, the boy who feeds the cows before school. And you'll hear it again. We don't whistle when the sun is down. The explanations vary. Some say it's just bad luck. Others mention animals you'll call the dogs, or worse, the snakes. A few will give you the look. You know the one. That half laugh, half warning, well, I don't believe it, but kind of look. The same one people give before telling you not to step on graves, or before they pour a drop of soju for the ancestors at Joseon. One village in the northern hills of Gyeongbuk province has a curious habit. At night, the houses turn off all music. Not just loud music, all music, even headphones, even lullabies. The residents say they do it for peace. But ask around a little more, and someone might mention a story. A family that once ignored the rule, a child that whistled himself awake in the middle of the night, crying, unable to speak. Just a coincidence, they'll say. But now, no one takes the risk. You might find a farmer bent-backed and leather-skinned from decades in the sun who says, we used to do it. As kids. Then the dog started barking, and my uncle saw something in the trees. Haven't whistled since. When you ask what he saw, he'll shrug. Not sure. But it was listening. Younger generations are more skeptical, of course. Many don't know the old stories. The internet is faster than oral tradition, but even among teenagers in these regions there's a strange respect. They might roll their eyes, but they won't whistle. Not loudly, not alone. There's a strange comfort in that, isn't there? In knowing that not everything has been paved over. That some part of the silence remains intact, unbroken, waiting in the hills. And not out of fear exactly, but habit. Cultural instinct. Like bowing slightly when you pass a shaman's tree. Or walking around, not across a stone cairn. You don't need to believe in it to feel its weight. And sometimes people do believe. One story from a southern village tells of a girl who kept hearing a whistle every night at 3 a.m. At first, she thought it was her brother sneaking out. Then, she thought it was a bird, but every time she looked outside, nothing. No breeze, no sound, just stillness. Eventually she asked her grandmother, who nodded and said, "It's not calling you, but it knows you hear it." The girl stopped listening after that, literally earplugs, every night. The whistling continued, then one day it didn't. The grandmother passed away the same morning. Coincidence maybe, but the villagers say the girl still wears a charm her grandmother gave her, an old coin wrapped in red thread, and she never ever whistles. Then there are the gut ceremonies still practiced in pockets of the countryside where shamans dance and sing and channel spirits through ancestral songs and offerings. Even here, where sound is the gateway to the divine, whistling is absent. Not forbidden, just not done. It's a sound with no lineage, a sound with no name attached. And that makes it dangerous. It's a strange thing, really. To realize how much silence can hold. You came expecting a story about ghosts, about superstition, about weird, obscure rules, and sure you got those. But what you really found was a map, drawn not in roads or rivers, but in absences, in gaps, in the things people don't do and the reasons they've half forgotten. Because whistling at night isn't just a sound, it's a gesture, an invitation, a declaration, and some declarations, even in 2025, are better left unspoken. So you continue walking now among houses where the television glows behind paper walls, where air conditioners hum softly against the quiet, where a radio plays trot music. 2 doors down. Life goes on. Noise returns. But the silence is still there, folded into the shadows. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can tell which houses remember, which houses know, because they all have something in common. They never whistle after dark. You find yourself retracing your steps now, the village quiet behind you and the hills rising ahead once more, like silent guardians seeing you off. The air has cooled, carrying the weight of the journey with it, a journey that began with a question about whistling and ended in a kind of reverence for silence. Still, there's one last path to take. One last walk, not through temples or tales, but into the quiet of your own thoughts. Because stories like these don't just live in books or voices, they live in you too if you let them. You pass again by the shrine, its silhouette familiar now, less ominous. The lantern that flickered earlier has burned out, but you know the way. You walk not with caution anymore, but with calm. You know what dwells in the dark here. Or rather, you know that the dark isn't empty and never was. So let's take this last stroll together. Let's walk the road one more time, not to learn, not to investigate, but to remember. Because the memory of a thing, when held gently, becomes a kind of prayer. You recall the gwishin, those pale figures in mourning white who followed uninvited sounds. You remember the snakes said to slither forth when the air split just so. You picture the mountain gods, ancient and half asleep, rustling slightly in the pine shadows. And you see too the monk walking barefoot through a misty courtyard, his robes whispering but his lips closed. The stories aren't there to frighten you now, they're there to complete the picture. You understand them the way you understand the sound of a river through reeds or the creak of old wood under moonlight. Not literal, not logical, just true. Because the silence that surrounded night whistling wasn't about fear, not really. It was about balance. About knowing when not to speak, when to listen instead. It was about honoring the moment, the air, the ancestors, and the unseen. Historians may keep arguing. Was it a superstition, a shamanic relic, a psychological reflex? Maybe all of them, maybe none. Maybe it's one of those cultural truths too wide for a single explanation, like why we hush ourselves in cemeteries, or why certain melodies make us cry without words. What matters is that for centuries, people heard the wind and chose not to answer it. That choice was sacred, and it made the world a little safer. Not safer from monsters or spirits perhaps, but safer from carelessness, from the noise that forgets to listen, from the arrogance that says nothing is watching. 'Cause something always is. Even now, as you turn onto the homeward road, there's a faint awareness beside you. Not a presence, not exactly, but a sense that the story walks with you. That it will keep walking long after this moment fades. That somewhere a grandmother is still reminding a grandchild to keep his lips shut after sundown, and somewhere else a boy on a motorbike is whistling just to see what happens, and someone maybe you will think twice before joining him. Because now you know, not just the facts, but the feeling. So let the story settle now. Let it soften. Let it rest like mist across a tiled roof. You've wandered long enough tonight, and what waits at the end isn't an answer. It's peace. The path home is smooth now. The night is deep, not heavy. Stars shine faintly above, scattered like old memories too distant to name. The wind has quieted, not stilled, but softened like breath across silk. Your steps slow, you don't need to rush. There's nothing chasing you, nothing waiting behind, only the sound of your own movement gradually blending back into the silence you came from. You've heard 1,000 voices tonight, some from centuries past, others whispered through pine branches or passed along through candlelight and kitchen steam. And now that those voices have gone quiet again, you're left with something gentler. A stillness that lingers not in fear, but in understanding. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to explain the story to anyone else. Just let it rest. Like a song that fades without needing to end. Like a bell that echoes long after it's been struck. You lie down now, wherever you are feeling the weight of your body ease into the floor, the bed, the earth. The story is done. The questions can wait. Let the wind keep watch tonight. Let the ghosts go unheard. Let the silence stay unbroken. No whistling, just rest, just breath, just sleep.